Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre. My name is Margaret Simons. I'm a journalist and also Director of the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne. Now, it's my job to chair tonight, but I am a participating chair, so I'll have a little bit more, hopefully a very little bit more, to say later. Now, one thing I should warn you, the blurb for tonight says we're going to talk about the I in journalism, the vertical pronoun. Personality journalism. We may touch on that, but we've had a bit of a discussion among ourselves and we think we can be far more interesting than that. So we're going to depart a fair bit from the blurb. So just be warned, if you want your money back. Oh, sorry, it's a free function. But anyway, you can leave now if you wish. But for now, I'll just introduce my fellow speakers. They probably need no introduction. The man on my left, Greg Jericho, otherwise known as Grog's Gamut, is an example of a phenomenon which I suspect is going to become increasingly common. Somebody who has made their way into the media, and we can talk about the extent to which Greg is or is not now an insider, purely through social media, blogging, a Twitter presence, and using the, I think, new capacity to actually talk directly to journalists in public, which social media offers. And Greg is also, of course, the author of the book The Fifth Estate, which is all about blogging and media and gate-watching the media. And that book is on sale somewhere up the back there tonight. The man on my right, Jonathan Holmes, is a professional journalist of many years standing, but of course is best known at the moment as the head or anchor of the ABC Media Watch programme, which sadly had its last episode on Monday of this week. Last episode of the year, sorry, I should say, not last episode forever.
That was a scoop.
Yes, I was going to say, I would scoop myself without even meaning to. But it will be back in the new year. We can ask Jonathan when later. Now, what we're going to do, I'm going to ask each of our speakers, including myself, to speak for 5 minutes or less, just giving you the basic pitch that they want to talk about today. And we've agreed that really our theme is new media and journalism and the extent to which the tent, if you like, is now bigger. More people can participate in the debate, or maybe not. And we might also touch on the perpetual question of what use are journalists? What are we good for, really, in this new world when anyone can publish? So we're all going to have a little bit of a say on our particular pitch on that. I should say my own book, which is called Journalism at the Crossroads, also on sale at a good bookshop near you, is about innovations in journalistic method, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I'll start with Greg. Over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Margaret. I'll actually quickly refer to the I part of journalism and media, because I was an example of someone who desperately tried not to be an I in the media, and it was journalists who refused to allow me to remain not an I, and outed me. And while I don't really want to go too far on me being a celebrity or an identity, what I was thinking about this morning about it was the way and the reasons why there seemed to be this need to attach a name to me. I think flows through a lot of the similar type of reactions between the media and those in social media, whether it be on blogs, Twitter, Facebook, what have you. And I was thinking how to categorise it or characterise it. It's almost, in some ways it's a little bit like the end of the Cold War, or a case where, if you look at even during the Cold War, nation-states were really good when they were able to fight other nation-states. That was wonderful for them. They knew how to fight those battles, whether actually militarily or in the UN or whatever. But when they were actually fighting, whether it be guerrilla organisations or non-state organisations, they were rather stumped, and they found that they really didn't know what to do. And so it's a case, I think, in the media, News Limited or the Australian, they've got no problems when they're fighting the ABC or Fairfax, and Fairfax fighting back. It's all wonderful and fun. But when it came to fighting these bloggers or someone who's just a Twitter handle, they really don't know what to do. And so what they do is much like nation states do, is they try and elevate their opponents to basically the same level. And so I was sort of, I think, attacked as though I was an actual journalist and that I should adhere to the rules that journalists adhere to, of putting my name to my pieces and being balanced, as they supposedly are. And I see that actually in a lot of things. It happened very much in America during the election campaign, where we had the bloggers who have now, such as Nate Silver and all these polling bloggers, who back in 2008 were just bloggers, and the media realised that actually there's some money to be made from these guys, and so they sort of co-opted them. But again, it was a case of many pundits in the media really struggling with how to cope with these people, because they weren't really journalists, but they were being treated with perhaps more respect than the journalists were, or the media organisation within which they were part of. And so you had people like Maureen Dowd writing of Nate Silver that, you know, he really didn't know what he was talking about because he wasn't out on the ground witnessing the fervent love for Mitt Romney that was really there. And similar to how I'm often criticised when I'll criticise someone for reporting on a speech or something, and they'll say, well, you really weren't there. I was talking to someone who told me off the record that what he was really saying was this, and that's what I report. Don't listen to actually what was said publicly. And it's always this thing, I think, of them really struggling of how to deal with people who are sort of doing journalistic-y things but aren't journalists. And I think the best thing recently was the misogynist speech, which we all know about. Just by saying misogynist speech, we know what we're talking about. But it was a case in the media, they really, I think, struggled with it. And for me, it was interesting because the opposite view wasn't some lone blogger like Grog's Gamut or someone who was saying, oh, you guys are all wrong. It was just people on Facebook, people on Twitter, just people emailing each other. And there was really nothing for the journalists to attack. There was no one to pick on. There was no Grog's Gamut who they could say, oh, this public servant is elevating Julia Gillard's speech to something that it's not. So they were reduced to sort of talking about social media as though social media was this state, was this almost news organisation. And journalists were, you know, Peter Van Onselen was tweeting, you know, oh, we'll only know whether Twitter is right when the news poll results came out. So again, it was this case of the only orbit that they could view it in was this media organisation sort of look. And to me, that is something that I think is going to be more interesting as the sort of, I guess, social media continues to grow, is how the media organisation is really going to struggle with it when there is no I to attack. It's just people's voices that are able to be carried around the world, around the country.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg, and we'll come back to that in questions. I should say that when we've all had our say, we're going to have a bit of a discussion between ourselves, and then there will be plenty of time for questions from you guys, as is appropriate on something in social media. One of the things that's interested me a great deal in the last few years is the potential of new media and social media to reinvent journalistic methodology, or at least to allow journalists to innovate in their methodology. For the first time, it's possible for journalists to have an exchange with the interested public in real time and in public. And, of course, this is happening at the same time as the business models which have traditionally supported journalism are threatened and probably largely broken. And I want to give you an example from China. I was on China recently in a research trip. In China, of course, Facebook and Twitter and most blogging tools are actually blocked. You can't use them. But there is a tool called Weibo, which is Chinese Twitter. Actually works better than Twitter in many ways, I have to say, except it's in Chinese. But while I was there was a terrible bus crash in one of the northern provinces of China. Awful thing. There was an inferno, 36 people burnt to death. It was just terrible. And the official news agency published a photo of the local official in charge of public safety with his arms akimbo, smiling in front of this scene of carnage. And on Weibo, there was absolute outrage. How could he be so callous? But then a particular anonymous tweeter or Weeber commented that not only was he smiling, he was also wearing a Rolex. This is a public official who's meant to have a salary of about $30,000. And then other people on Weibo went and searched for all the previous news agency photographs of this official and found that in every photo he was wearing a different luxury watch and luxury sunglasses, luxury belts, high-quality clothing and so on. And they added up how much all of these accessories were worth and came to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, all the time I was in China, I was hearing about this. I wasn't able to read Weibo myself, of course, but I was having people translate it for me. Journalists I met and spoke to were talking about it. Journalism students were talking about it. Everybody knew about it. Not a word in the official state-owned media. And on the last day I was in China, suddenly it was in People's Daily and the Shanghai Daily and the party-owned media, and the next day the guy was sacked and is currently in jail on corruption charges. They found millions of yuan, which don't belong to him. Now, what those people on Weibo did was undoubtedly, to my mind, journalism. It was investigative journalism, in fact. They're anonymous. I don't know whether they would identify as professional journalists or not, but clearly they are participating in a journalistic process. And by doing so, in the society in the world which is perhaps best at repression, they have managed to move and disrupt the power relationships. Now, of course, we live in a very different society from China, but I think that that is a great example of how broadening the participation in journalistic processes can be very healthy, but certainly disrupts existing power networks, of which, of course, the mainstream media is one. Now, there's a whole load of other things that you can do with innovative journalistic methodology as well, and that's what my book is about. But I think it's fair to say that mainstream journalists have had, and I include myself in this, have had a great gig for a very long while. It really has been a lot of fun. And it's very hard to give up. And this can make journalists more conservative, small c conservative, than the general population. Most office workers in large organisations over the last couple of decades have had to learn a whole load of new media skills, not only email, but how to use an intranet quite often, if not the internet. Many would have learned how to deal with blogs, certainly sophisticated uses of Google. There were journalists who've recently been made redundant in this town who don't even know how to open a Word document or use PowerPoint. They haven't had to know.
Seriously?
Yeah. Now, it's an indictment on their managements that they haven't been made to find out, but it is also a fair criticism of them, I think.
Can they type?
They can type. It is also an indictment on them, I think, that they haven't realised that these are now essential skills for operating in the modern world. Sad but true. So I think there is an innate conservatism in journalism which tells you in a way what a very good gig it's been. And personally, I think it's mainly healthy that we're now being forced to share that gig a bit more widely. But over to you, Jonathan.
I'm wearing a tie because I'm the mainstream tonight.
And a blue tie too.
And can I say how very nice it is to be in a civilised city with civilised people. I'm trapped in Sydney for 43 weeks in the year. Anyway. Just a few remarks, 3 brief points. To the extent that mainstream media sees itself in competition with social media, as Greg said, in some sort of opposition to it, it's partly because they do recognise, the mainstream does recognise that it is a competition. Its own business model is in deep trouble, as we all know. It's desperately looking for ways that it can maintain its power as gatekeeper and its sales. Now, if I have any criticism of Greg's excellent book, it's that I don't know to the extent to which he acknowledges that what he's actually talking about is a very tiny percentage of the population who are deeply engaged in politics, deeply engaged in policy, read the blogs, go on Twitter to do those kinds of things. What most of the media, with the exception of the Australian notably, is doing is talking to much, much broader audiences in much more populist ways than the kind of thing that Greg's talking about in his book. And what concerns me, I mean, we were saying earlier, does it matter if the mainstream media goes overboard altogether? Would it actually damage democracy? We've all got these wonderful new tools that we can talk to each other about. Yes, those of us who want to can. What the Daily Telegraph or the Herald Sun or 9 or 7 News do is they bring at least a skerrick of the political conversation to the mass, to the broad public. Now, of course, one of the ironies is that what's been discovered as we've gone online, and we can see what stories people click on and what they don't in a way we never used to be able to do, is that actually the public is very uninterested in policy and politics. They don't want to know. They want to know largely about, Hollywood gossip and such like things. That's where you get the clicks. And that's why when you read the Sydney Morning Herald website or the Age website, it's completely different priorities to what you see in the print paper, which is still read by older people with different interests. But to the extent that there is a competition, a lot of mainstream people feel defensive because they think it's an unfair competition for this reason. It's absolutely true, as Chris Mitchell pointed out to Julie Passetti famously, that people who tweet are subject to defamation laws. But they're not nearly as subject if you're on a blog or you're tweeting as you are if you are the Australian or the ABC, simply because you don't have the money to be worth suing, number one. And it's an extremely expensive matter, of course, to sue anybody, so defamation is very rarely used except by the rich and powerful, but they don't see any point in suing the unrich and unpowerful. And the second thing is that if the blogosphere is onto a story, or a small number of blogs are onto a story, and the Gillard-Wilson scandal is a classic example of this. It's been flourishing on the internet for at least a couple of years in a big way, and bashing away at the door to get the mainstream media to recognise it. And really it was Hadley Thomas's stuff in the middle of this year when he got the transcript of the interview from Julia Gillard at Slater and Court, and that really opened the floodgates. It made it possible for the politicians to start asking questions, and that made it possible for the press galleries to go, or indeed essential, as they saw it, for the press gallery to take up the story. And now we've got a full-blown political crisis. But it's only when the mainstream take it up that really happens. At this stage, and I don't know how much longer it will last, the politicians can afford to ignore the blogs, and it's much better for them to do so. If Julia Gillard started suing Mike Smith or whoever else, all she would be doing would be magnifying the story enormously. Far, far better to ignore it. But there comes a point when the mainstream media can't ignore it. And the third short point I want to make about is that to the extent there's competition, one of the people's whose jobs is most at threat is mine. Because one of the things that social media has done, most notably in the last couple of years, I think, is to give the public for the very first time a truly effective way of making the mainstream media accountable. All we've had before, apart from Media Watch, essentially is the Australian Press Council, the ACMA, and both of which take, especially in the case of the ACMA, it takes years and years and slaps on wrists and all of that stuff that we know about. And the Press Council has been owned and entirely operated by, until very recently. I think it's got a bit more teeth now. But now what we now see is the ability, the classic example of the young girl who was killed in a quad bike accident outside Wollongong recently, and 7 News sent a helicopter, and the Illawarra Mercury published pictures of the girl without the permission of the parents. They went onto Facebook on 7, they went onto Facebook, the Illawarra Mercury. There was a huge backlash, and 7 had to grovel and apologise. That's never happened before. It's quite remarkable. And the same thing happened with misogyny speech, if you like, in a different way. The public's saying, it's reading this unanimous views from the press gallery, it's saying, we don't agree. And they're all running after themselves, trying to find out where they went wrong. I think that's actually fascinating. I think it's healthy, and it's something that the mainstream media is only grappling with right now.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. I want you to imagine something, gentlemen. Within the next few years, some of the people that I've once described as the God correspondents in Canberra, Michelle Grattan, Laurie Oakes, will be retiring.
Laurie Oakes is just about retired.
Laurie Oakes is just about retired, that's right. Paul Kelly also will be heading towards retirement, not that he's Canberra-based these days. This is itself, of course, an enormous change. What will those who are left after that value add? Do they do anything that a single AAP reporter attending the press conferences and holding the microphone outside the back doors on the Senate side, do they do anything that couldn't be done by a single reporter or a small AAP team? Greg?
Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure how much they value add now, if I'm really brutal.
Feel free.
I mean, Laurie Oakes and, they're fine reporters. I mean, Laurie Oakes still actually reports and will get scoops, and I guess Michelle Grattan as well. I mean, Paul Kelly's pretty much just doing his weekly column and going on the Sky program.
Pontification.
Yeah, and giving us all his gravitas, and I don't think that actually adds much value, because it can be done by anybody who has observed politics for as long as he has and is able to write well. Now, in the past, to be in that position, you had to be a journalist, because what else could you do? You could write a newsletter and no one's going to see it. But there are actually people out there who have been following politics for ages, whether because they were a teacher in that area or a lecturer, or they just, they used to work in that area or whatever, and they can write about it and write a damn good opinion piece as well as Paul Kelly. I mean, you might say, some of he's getting the inside tip or something like that, but for every good inside tip that suggests, something's going to happen and it does, there's many dozens that nothing happens. I mean, today in the paper we're reading, from some anonymous ALP MP that Julia Gillard was perilously close to losing her leadership last night. I mean, really? I think that inside sort of overbearing knowledge, I'm not sure if I think they're probably the ones most at risk from the blogosphere.
Well, if I could offer a counter argument to that, I mean, one of the things that the professional journalist still has is access.
Yeah.
And that's something that social media, I would suggest, can't replicate. So, for example, if a George Megalogenis, for example, is going to write something on the budget, he can probably ring up the treasurer and get a background briefing.
Yeah, well, I would say George... But see, this is the thing, you sort of pitched it as Paul Kelly, Michelle Grattan, and that. And this is the other thing, I don't think we should treat all bloggers the same, and definitely not all media journalists the same, all members of the press gallery the same. Certainly they do have access, but again, I think that's going to break down more and more. In America, Jonathan was saying how at the moment the politicians aren't really paying attention to the blogs, and best to ignore them. In America, very much the blogs are an important aspect of the media. Now, it's important because they've got the population, so a single blogger can be read by millions, and can or have a reach of millions, even if they don't have that readership. And it's never going to be quite that same in Australia. But it's Julia Gillard was having lunch with that group of mummy bloggers and whatever. I mean, it's that access is. Yes, I've got access, but I've chatted to politicians on Twitter. Every interview I had for my book with politicians, from Malcolm Turnbull to Andrew Lee and so forth, was arranged through Twitter. I just messaged them, and they'd never met me before, but they knew who I was through my blog. I wasn't writing really for the drum at that stage. I was, basically nobody, but because of writing my blog and how they'd seen me interact on Twitter, they knew that I wasn't some loon or anything. And so, I think that's one of the things that perhaps is also a bit panicky about for journalists, is that, yes, they do have this access, but social media really brings you cheek to jowl with politicians, and you can get into a debate with a politician on Twitter and have a good back and forth, as well as any journalist having a sit-down interview. So,
Jonathan, what do you think? Would you agree with that?
Look, I don't think that we'll miss those particular people much. I don't think they're... I mean, they've hung on to their jobs a long time, as a lot of us have, the baby boomers, but they're not irreplaceable, and there'll be plenty of, even if nothing happened to the mainstream media, there will be plenty of good people coming through who are able to replace them. That's not the issue. The issue is, are they actually valuable? And they're much less valuable. There's no question. I totally agree with Greg. I mean, Paul Kelly, for all his sage-like wisdom gets it wrong as often as he gets it right, and there are innumerable people out there who can talk with not the same political experience going back over 40 years perhaps, but I mean just as interesting and acute observations on policy as Paul. The question remains, though, what kind of world it will be if the mainstream media ceases to really pay much attention to politics at all. And frankly, apart from the Australian and the ABC and the Fairfax broadsheets and the Fin Review, nobody much does in the mainstream media anymore because, as I said, nobody actually is interested out there. Not nobody, but not enough people are interested to make it into a mass medium topic of interest. I mean, they used to interview politicians on A Current Affair and Today Tonight. You don't see one, in a blue fit now. Maybe once a year they'll interview the Prime Minister for 5 minutes, and their ratings will plunge.
Yeah.
But what happens to the national conversation? That's the concern I have. Greg and people like him who've got the means and the interest and the time will always be much better informed, arguably, than they would have been 20 years ago, no question. It's the gulf, if you like, between those who are engaged and informed because they master the much more diffuse and confusing world of online journalism, or whatever you want to call it, and those who, frankly, never gave a stuff, but they kind of got it through telly and they got it through the papers that they occasionally read. Now, we have compulsory, it wouldn't perhaps matter if you didn't have compulsory voting, but we do. And I mean, that's my concern, it's just, do we continue to have a national conversation? And we do at the moment, and it's about things like who's going to win the X Factor.
But isn't that, I mean, isn't that a goes to just as much the media model that you're talking about? And I agree, if it's a case of we just got the newspaper and that's getting less, politics discussion there is getting less and less interesting.
It's the diffuseness of it, Greg. I'm talking about not so much. It's not so much the lack of. I mean, it's not that we're going to miss Paul Kelly. It's that a world in which there were very few sources of information and everybody knew roughly the same things is a very different world. I'm not saying it's a better one, from a world in which there's a mass of information and views out there, and you pick and choose what you want if you want any of them. But there's, at the moment, the mainstream still does that concentrating business.
Well, can I challenge you on that in a couple of points, Jonathan? I mean, on the one hand, I think most of the academic research into the commonly asserted allegation that people aren't interested in politics anymore, most of the academic research into that actually counters that and says that levels of interest are the same but different, less party political affiliation, but just as much interest in issues and so on. Now, we can argue about whether that's right or wrong. But also, I mean, the misogyny speech, which we say everybody knows about, I mean, that was most certainly a matter of the national conversation despite the mainstream media. A few years ago, if that speech had been made, unless you've been watching the televised version of Parliament, you wouldn't have known it had happened or wouldn't have known it was significant, as it was even before the political journalists had finished writing dismissive pieces about it. It was being discussed worldwide.
Yes, it was being discussed worldwide, and we can argue about who was right and wrong. I mean, in many ways, the press gallery, I think, were doing their job in putting it into the political context in which it was actually made, and they were trying to make instant guesses about whether, in fact, most of them didn't even mention it or even listen to it because they were busily writing the story about Slipper, which seemed to them crucial at the time, and if you were in Canberra, it would have been, and so that's just a disjunction of view. But I mean, I think they were to some extent doing their job in making sure that people were aware that it was in the context of an ongoing highly political attack on Abbott and so on and so forth. Yeah. But in isolation, the speech became a meme which people reacted to in isolation globally. Yes. And that's an interesting phenomenon. I don't think it necessarily proves the press gallery were wrong, but that there are two ways of looking at things, or many ways of looking at things. As to a national conversation, well, I don't know. I mean, that's what, when that person said, we'll see who's right when the news poll came out, that's what he meant. There was a arguably not very large section of the population who was deeply excited and engaged by that speech. and the press gallery are guessing that it wasn't going to penetrate to the mainstream and make a difference to the polls and so on. Now, I don't even know who's right about that yet.
I think one of the problems with this discussion is when we're talking about politics, we're doing, and I sort of refer to this in the book when I'm writing about women bloggers, and is we're talking about capital P politics. We're talking about what happened in question time, which really doesn't matter at all, as I wrote today in the drum. Because it's discussing big issues, or it's discussed not big issues, but supposedly big issues, but it's not actually discussing the political issues that will interest the people. And when something political is happening, let's say it's the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which if you're writing about, if you were to write a report about the debate in Canberra over the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, it'd be boring as anything. But out in the rural areas, that is a massive issue, and any reporting on, if you're a local newspaper, that's going to be a big issue because it actually matters to the people. And I think if that might actually be something that needs to be, it might be a case of the Paul Kellys and people like me when I was writing my blog and writing about politics and what happened in question time today and the cut and thrust. That might kind of become very niche, and actually we don't really need to employ you to do that anymore, but we need someone who can understand and write about the debate on education or something in a way that actually gets through to people, and actually people realise that actually I need to read that, because that's what media in the end is, and all news is about, is convincing people that they need to know this. And there's masses of stuff in newspapers we don't need to know. But we've been we believe that we do need to know it because the way it's reported, and we can trust it. But
Greg, I think one of the things that you're absolutely right is in danger, and it's not a bad thing, is that whole clubby press gallery atmosphere where, yes, it's true they've got access and it's extremely dangerous. I mean, we know the extent to which anyone who sort of had anything to do with the press gallery, and I've never worked there, knows that a vast amount of what goes on is this constant feedback and back scratching between the pollies and the journos. Information being fed, for part of the political battle, the Harcher-Rudd syndrome and the Costello Shanahan syndrome, well, not Shanahan, who was it? Glenn Milne, all of that stuff. And it's incestuous. It doesn't have much to do with what the public's interested in. It's all about the party political battle and the horse race. And I think that is because all of those people are sitting in that building, and that's what they do, And that is what people, the editors are discovering the public isn't that interested in and isn't clicking on. So I think it will go to a great extent, but that doesn't mean we don't need a mainstream media. That's or rather, I'm not saying we don't need it, but I still think. I mean, one of the Four Corners that I did when I worked at Four Corners, I did a program that everybody said was going to be deeply, deeply boring, and it didn't have any kind of villains, and it wasn't exciting. It wasn't a narrative. It was all the things you shouldn't do. It didn't have any pictures. It was about how you actually save energy in your house. Rated the second top of all the Four Corners programs that year. People fascinated by that. Journos have got very funny ideas about what is journalism and what isn't, and what's a good story and what isn't. And half the time I think they're discovering, now that they've got this feedback mechanism, that they're wrong.
It's interesting you mentioned the Murray-Darling Basin, Greg, because I was in Mildura last week. I get around, Shanghai one week, Mildura the next. And on the front page of the Sunraysia Daily there was a story about the Murray-Darling Basin, but it was Bob Catter in town, stirring up discontent, obviously, for political reasons. And it was entirely devoid of context about what the Murray-Darling Basin actually meant for Mildura or the nation as a whole, which is interesting. So the local media isn't always, I think, closer to the real issues than
No, they will interview Jennifer Marahasi too. Anyway.
Well, let's. I want to turn to the audience for questions very shortly, but in the next 5 minutes, I'd just like you to imagine what a healthy political journalism, no matter who's doing it, would look like. What's a better way of doing it? What sorts of issues? What sorts of methods?
Political journalism?
Yeah, political journalism, but not necessarily what Greg calls capital P, political.
As long as I can remember, people have been saying what the public wants to know about is policy, not politics. And yet it's been extraordinarily difficult to write about it in a way that engages people. I still think that's a huge issue. I don't know if people are honest about what they read and what they don't. But reading about serious policy is it's hard work. Writing about it's hard work. Reading about it, and I'm not all that optimistic that that's going to change. The reason that the press gallery writes about the horse race is because it is at least easily understood who's winning. We can all understand that. You know, who's getting a knife put in their back. We can all understand that. So I don't know that as long as there is mass journalism trying to engage a broad public in federal politics, that the horse race analysis will ever go away, or the fascination with polls and so on and so on. And I can't actually imagine a world in which both the politicians and the journalists suddenly discover the virtues of having serious political debate about, serious debate about policy and not really worrying who's going to win the next election. I can't imagine it.
Greg?
That's fairly pessimistic, isn't it? I wrote how I thought the 2010 election was the worst election coverage of all time and everything, and I have to admit, with regards to the 2013 one, I'm fairly optimistic that it can be at least as bad. But I'm actually...
That's actually pessimistic.
I'm actually... No, my natural pessimism comes through in thinking that actually I think it'll be worse. So, I'm trying to imagine what's going to be a good... how can I put it? I actually think what we have now is actually not terrible. And what I mean by that is that actually if there is that sort of, I guess, generalistic coverage, but there is now, because of the internet, there is, if you want to find it, you can find good stuff there.
Absolutely.
Whether it's, say, on The Conversation, where you've got people who actually know about the policy writing about it, or I've got a mate who used to work in a government department, but who basically is an environmental engineer, knows all about... He was actually able to write a very easy-to-understand piece about how the national electricity grid works and how the carbon tax all feeds into that I was like, why...
Did he talk to Graham Lloyd about it at all?
No, unfortunately. And so I think it's a case of what is a good media is just one where those other voices are more easily known and more easy to be found. And I think it doesn't mean, and I've never suggested that the mainstream media should die off and we don't need it. There might be some sections that I think are redundant.
You just like it to be better.
Yeah, well, no, I just think we don't need... I just think there are some things we don't need, and that... But in terms of when I'm writing about, when you write about the blogs and things like that, it's such an early stage. And it's true that most people, haven't read my blog or haven't read my mate's blog or never read The Conversation. They've been around 2 years or something. This is real early really stage. Yeah. Wait, give us time to, when it gets to the point of we've got, in 10 years' time, we will not be able to remember not being able to look at the internet on our phone. It'd be just amazing. I mean, I can't function without it at the moment, and my 3G is not working very well. So today I've been going around the internet trying to, find out what's happening in the world and getting frustrated because I can't access the internet on my phone. So in 10 years' time, when that is just such a natural thing, finding these different voices, I think will be there, and it won't be a competing business model. I think it's just... There's a lot of cracks that the mainstream media leaves open to be filled by people who actually can write really well, some not really well, And so, I don't think it's that terrible if you look at the whole picture.
I mean, the one thing that's worth noting, I think, is that journalism hasn't really changed very much in its essential methodology since it started.
One just brief obeisance to the blurb. One of the
Here we go.
Seriously, one of the interesting things that there's been a cycle. 40 years ago, practically nobody had bylines. Journos didn't have bylines. The Times never ever had bylines. At the Times of Britain, and gradually the bylines came in, and then the pictures came in, and then the columnists started, and now you've got phenomena like Annabel Crabb and Joe Hildebrand, who are brands, in their own right, regardless of who they write for or
well,
where
you are
they
too, Jonathan, aren't you?
Huh?
You are too, aren't you?
Well, I'm on television. It's different, I'm not. These people. Annabelle has only just recently started on television, but she was a brand before. She started doing Kitchen Cabinet. And that's an interesting phenomenon. But it's worth noting that the most successful traditional media outlet in the world at the moment, arguably, is The Economist, which has no bylines. I wonder what that tells us, if anything. But the place where you get the sort of anonymous, or more often, at least not bylined stuff that can be just as good is out there on the web. So, I don't know really what that says about anything, except that it's kind of interesting.
And it's actually, just on that, it's also interesting that AAP and AP are sort of expanding their services and almost trying to... You can get information straight from them, and of course they don't use bylines either.
Now, I'm going to stop you there, not because you're not being interesting, but because I want to allow time for questions from the audience. If you can, please wait until the microphone reaches you. We've got a few roaming around. Okay, we've got a question down the centre there, and then there's hands everywhere.
Thank you. I had a question for sort of a comment and question following. It was just interesting, Greg, that the Australian just ignored their ethics regarding anonymity and the sacrosanct nature of the anonymous source when you as Grog Gamut, you're your own anonymous source. But it seems to me that this... the ethics of anonymity and the anonymous source in the mainstream media is being misused terribly. It's got really bad in America. And you go from the true whistleblower down through leaking, backgrounding, malevolent gossip, and the drinks at the pub.
Can you bring it to a question, sir?
And I'm just wondering, is there a level at which anonymous sourcing should be not given to actually make the sources more accountable?
Jonathan.
Anonymous sources should be not given. Sorry. What do you mean? Should not be available. Look, you shouldn't quote anonymous sources. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, in some circumstances.
Well, I don't think it's workable to say journalists should not rely on sources that they won't name. Although using unnamed sources is always tricky, because you can always be being used, you can be being fed falsehoods. One of the things I think the Media Alliance Code of Ethics should say is the moment it says if you give a promise of confidentiality to a source, you should maintain that in all circumstances. Well, sorry, I say to anonymous sources when I use them, and you rarely do on television, if I find out that what you are telling me is false, and I suspect that you know that it's false, or I can prove that you knew that it was false when you told me, then all bets are off. I'm not going to be confidential about that. And that does happen sometimes, But no, I don't think that you can rule out the use of anonymous sources in journalism. It would completely restrict what you did. On the other hand, I absolutely agree with you that anonymity on the web, and this is an old issue, does give incredible license to rudeness and bullying and stupidity and the comments column. The comments on the drum depress me, I have to say, enormously. And I don't believe they would be as rude or as combative or as uninformative or as generally useless if people had to put their names to them. I agree with you that I think it's dangerous and can be abused, but equally And I think there's an argument for saying, maybe some websites like The Drum, which is the ABC's website, should say, no, we're not going to have anonymous comments. If you don't put your name to it, you can't comment. And that would be kind of an interesting experiment. Because it would change the nature, I think, of the sort of comments you got and the sort of people that went on it. And it might be very healthy. I don't know, what do you reckon?
What about WikiLeaks? I mean...
What about what?
What about WikiLeaks? Should people be able to leak anonymously to WikiLeaks?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, the bigger argument I have with journalists when I sort of spar with them on Twitter about anonymous sources that they're using, occasionally and this happened during the whole Rudd spill thing last year, where there were just 6 months worth of articles about how Rudd's going to challenge soon and all this, and it was all based on anonymous ALP insider or ALP close insider or whatever. And and that respond, if we, it's like Watergate needed, Deep Throat to be anonymous. So and it's this sort of elevation of them getting a phone call from, a ALP insider who obviously wants the story pushed with whistleblowers, and obviously we don't want to. Whistleblowing and the reporting of whistleblowers is a vital aspect that we'd hate to leave. But the great thing I think about the emergence of social media and blogs is that you're able now, when you spot what is obviously just a cosy relationship between an anonymous source pushing an agenda that they want and a journalist being able to then write a story that has a bit of a splash, but is basically we're working together, is that people can call them out for it, and say, well, this is,
But what do you reckon about anonymity by authors on the blog? I mean, on
comments. I have no problems with it. I think it's not a case of... The big difference is between anonymous comments, which is someone who today the Joe blogs, tomorrow the Jill blogs, tomorrow the Joe blogs 20... you have no idea of tracing who they are. I always took issue with people saying, oh, you're an anonymous blogger. And I say, no, I'm not. I'm Grog's Gamut writing my blog, and if you've got an issue with anything I've written, I'm Grog's Gamut on Twitter, and we've been... I'd be talking to someone like Samantha Maiden or someone saying, hey, we've been debating this, everything I've said.
I don't have a problem with that.
And so that's why I think
that's a pseudonym.
I think there is a case for allowing pseudonyms, but it's a case you have to stick to that one pseudonym. That's why I think being able to register either through Facebook, which often uses a name, or through Twitter, where you don't have to use a name, but you actually have to register. And websites, they're able to track IP addresses, so they can see that, oh, hey, you're keep registering with a different Twitter handle or something, well, you're banned, and so I think there is that case, and New York Times does it well. Some people use their names and some people don't, but it's a case of you have to register. But what it also comes down to, which definitely doesn't happen on The Drum and definitely doesn't happen on most websites, news websites, is the moderation. You need to actually pay someone to be moderating, be part of the discussion, guiding the discussion if it needs to, putting an end to some things, and not just sort of leaving it to the work experience kid to say, well, make sure nothing defamatory gets through or something. It actually needs to be more than that if you actually want the comments to be worth reading.
That could have a major impact on work experience tasks. Okay, another question.
Yeah, for Greg, what's the potential for making an income out of blogging? I mean, you've got a profile and now presumably you're getting some paid gigs. Is it something you can see a future in doing full time and making an income from?
Not political blogging, not the style I do. I'd have to get a bit more salacious, I think, if I was going to do it. I mean, there's sort of talk that Mike Smith's getting heaps of hits, and perhaps he can actually make a little bit out of it. But obviously, in America, again, you can sort of make some money out of it. And there are bloggers in Australia who I know do quite well. I think William Bowe for Crikey with Paul Bludger. I think, that's a good sort of part-time.
The people who are making real money at the moment, I hate to use the word, and I apologise to anyone who defends them, but it's the handle that's attacked is the so-called mummy bloggers.
Yeah.
I mean, because they are talking to women who do shop a lot online, who have stuff that they want to buy, and these people give them advice about what's a good thing to buy and what's a bad thing to buy in a way that they trust, in a way they don't trust advertisements. Those are very powerful selling tools for the brands, and they've discovered them, and they're making, some of them are really making quite good money already. And in the States, there are some mummy bloggers who are literally making, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year.
Yeah.
I have to say there are people who do make money from blogging, including here in Melbourne. But quite often the blog is just one of a suite of things that they do, and the blog acts as publicity for public events, for books. I mean, Greg himself is probably
it's certainly,
some
I guess I've got a semi-career out of it. I mean, it certainly is a way into it, but I certainly couldn't just survive on the blog unless I started writing about.
I mean, political
So
blogging doesn't attract
what else do you
capital.
do, Greg? I mean, is the rest of your income earning these days in some way related to Grog's Gamut, or is it?
Yeah, well, it's related to writing for the Drum and yeah. I mean, I'm at the moment working as a researcher for Planet America on ABC 24, and that came out just through contacts made with.
So you stitched a portfolio career together.
Yeah, well, I mean, I
from the
guess
portfolio
like
development.
sort of freelance journalists do, not calling myself a journalist, but freelance writers do. You try and you take your hand at whatever's available.
I mean, one of the things I think inevitably will happen too is that it's very hard to make a living as a blogger. It's going to become increasingly difficult to make a living as a journalist, obviously for the same reason, because there's so much out there that's free, that's just as good, frankly. I mean, I think that Greg's analysis of politics is every bit as good as people who have been paid a great deal of money to write similar stuff, and he usually does a lot more work. Just isn't paid for it. But that's going, this is the trouble with the so-called business model. I mean, why would you pay somebody $150,000 a year to do something that, an academic or somebody else is doing in their spare time just as well?
So we may be looking at cottage industry rather than big news factories. Okay, we have another question.
Hi, Jonathan. You just sort of mentioned then the fact that why would you pay someone $150,000 more or whatever if they knew that sort of space around that particular policy and they were interested in it? Do you think that there is a case, if we were to see better policy writing, we need to actually find journalists that understand the subject matter they're talking about, a deep understanding of it, rather than just that cursory, I'll flip over the executive summary and print that?
Yes and no. I think for the specialist niche media that will replace a lot of what we now have. I think things like Jericho Report has shown the way that there are areas where you can make a living in a form of journalism that has a lot of expertise attached to it. It won't be a big audience, but it'll be an interested audience, an engaged audience, and you'll have to really know your stuff. That's one way, and the other kind of media that I think will survive for a bit longer, I don't know how much longer, is the truly mass media where you don't need much expertise at all except for how to make a story sexy, whatever the story is and about whatever it is, and that's the sort of populist end. I think that the people that are in trouble are in fact newspapers like The Australian, which don't have that big an audience already, and they are effectively competing. That's why they're so defensive on The Australian of people like Greg and attack him, because they see the threat. This guy's actually daring to do the same stuff that we do, and we only got 180,000 readers as it is,
Yeah, I mean, in terms of writing about policy, as what Jonathan was saying before, it is really hard to do. And I know when I was working as a public servant, writing my blog, and I was writing pretty much 5-6 days a week, the reason I was able to do it was because mostly I was writing about politics. I was writing about Question Time. It's easy. I could do it after dinner and sit down and belt out 2,000 words in a couple of hours. But whenever I'd think, there's a big policy's come out, I really want to write about this, well, that'd take me days where all night I'd be reading bloody documents and I'd be petrified to write about it because I know there are people out there who know more about this than me. So, but the problem is if you go to the experts, well, a lot of experts aren't actually good writers, and it is very difficult to. It's an amazing skill if you come across someone who can write about something very technical in a way that someone who is not technically minded can understand it. And people who can do that generally do find a way to get paid to do it because it is a very valuable skill. And I think those people, there will always be somewhere that they can get paid to do that.
There was a lead story today in the Sydney Morning Herald, I don't know if it was in the Age as well, by Ben Cubby about the melting tundra. Classic example, really good, interesting, well-written story about something really, really important. They put it on the front page. It doesn't happen all that often, but it's really nice when you see it in the mainstream media. And of course, that information has been massively available to anyone who's interested in global warming for ages on blogs and things. But that's what the mainstream does, is it takes stuff that a few people know and hopefully it gets more people to know.
And it's also an example when a good story like that does appear on the mainstream media. The social media is certainly not in opposition to it. They will flood links to it, say that you must read this. This is a great story, and it'll get sent around. So it's a case of, I think the opposition aspect is foolish because if it is such a resource, the social media, to drive.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree.
Now we've got time for one, perhaps two more questions. So we've got one in.
Yes. I've been listening to you talking about Twitter and blogs and, that perhaps they're going to be a bigger force, or they are quite a large force now and are in the future. One thing I get quite worried about when I think about that is investigative journalism and the ability for these places to dedicate time and time to do it. I mean, as a blogger, Greg, you were saying, it takes a long time to look at policy, but what about, the scary future where papers don't have the time to dedicate, to have investigative journalists following stories, or that there aren't papers or whatever, and is there any scope for Twitter or bloggers to fill that space?
Well, I would actually say that the example I gave from China is an example of investigative journalism. I'm not suggesting it's enough. I do think that what you've identified is the big risk. But it's not as though there are no other ways of doing it or no other ways of citizens finding things out. But still, I'll let the other panels...
on that, I think there are some aspects of... When people talk about investigative journalism, and I always sort of say, and they talk about the Watergate and thing, where would that happen? Well, I always remember, the Watergate journalists, they weren't in the White House press corps. In fact, the White House press corps didn't want to know about it. They were too busy following the candidates around. It's a case of... And, Hedley Thomas is not in the press gallery. In fact, he seems to hate the press gallery because they never ask the right questions to Julia Gillard. So I'm not sure if we... if the coverage of the capital P politics sort of dwindles and all that actually will get rid of the investigative journalists, of the people who's looking at police corruption or something like that.
Greg, journalism isn't just the press gallery.
No, I know, but this is what I'm saying, and this is my point, that when you say that investigative journalists are going to go...
But the question is about, can we afford investigative journalism, not can we afford the fucking press gallery.
No, but I'm saying...
investigative journalism is very expensive, it's very time-consuming, it's very tough to do. There's probably only, I would say, about a dozen real investigative journalists employed by the mainstream media right now. People who are allowed, as Hedley is, or as Sarah Ferguson is, or as Kate McClymont is, to go away and spend real time digging on stuff that's hard to find out. And even they, some believe, go badly skew if at times and get it all wrong. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's it's very hard to get enough readers to actually follow it to justify it. So I think it is in danger now. Whether that matters, or whether there are substitutes for it, or whether what Meg's trying to start up with alternative ways of financing it. We will see,
But is that in danger because...
it's in danger because the business model...
Because of the business model. I don't think it's in danger because there's Twitter.
Well, no, but
And
business models
I've never thought that there are people. Oh, Twitter will be able to do that job.
No.
I don't. So
No.
I don't.
But we're not talking about Twitter. We're talking about it's the internet that has utterly endangered the old business models. That's what's done it. The internet as a avenue for advertising.
As an
primarily.
advertising medium.
Sarah Ferguson works on TV.
What?
There are other journalism besides newspapers, though. I mean, what about investigative journalists
isn't it
on television?
more than the internet?
60 Minutes?
Isn't it really the fragmentation of the audience, which is broader than just the internet? It's also about digital multi-channels, many screens and many houses.
And the fact that you advertise your house much more effectively on the internet than you do in a newspaper, all of those things. But I mean, I agree with the questioner that one of, and this is, you've been working on this for ages, Meg. I mean, one of the accidental casualties, if you like, of a whole new phenomenon might well be investigative journalism. Well, that might be one of the ones that we really miss, and at the moment we don't know how to pay for it. That's all.
Yes, in America, of course, there is philanthropically supported investigative journalism. Whether that's sustainable in the long term is an open question, I think. We are out of time, I'm afraid, and we could go on all night, so I apologise for that. I can see hands going up and down all the time. First of all, I'd like to thank the Wheeler Centre. I'd like to thank all of you for being here, and please join me in thanking Greg and John.